March 23, 1945, 0640 hours. Somewhere in the jungle north of Manila, Philippines, Private First Class Billy Hartwell woke to the sound of bamboo creaking and realized he'd lost count of the days. He was 18 years old, captured during the battle for Manila 6 weeks earlier, and now held in a makeshift prison camp carved into the dense tropical forest. The camp wasn't marked on any map. No Red Cross knew it existed. No Allied intelligence had reported it. Hartwell and 43 other American prisoners, most of them teenagers, most of them captured in the chaotic final weeks of the Philippine campaign, had been marched here in February and told nothing. No interrogations. No explanations. Just guards, bamboo cages. Thin rice gruel once a day, and the suffocating heat of the jungle pressing down like a living thing. Hartwell sat up on the dirt floor, his back against the bamboo slats, and looked at the faces around him. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, silent. They'd stopped talking about rescue 2 weeks ago. Stopped talking about anything that wasn't immediate. Water, food, the guard rotations, who was sick, who might not make it through the night. Hope had become a luxury they couldn't afford. And in the gray pre-dawn light, Hartwell understood that if rescue didn't come soon, it wouldn't matter. They were dying, slowly, quietly, and nobody knew they were here. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. The collapse of Manila in February 1945 had been brutal and chaotic. Japanese forces, retreating in the face of American advances, had turned the city into a killing ground, burning buildings, massacring civilians, fighting street by street with a desperation that bordered on madness. American infantry units pushed into the city, taking heavy casualties, clearing block by block, tried to hold ground while the Japanese launched counterattacks from sewers, tunnels, and concealed positions. In the confusion, entire squads were cut off, surrounded, overrun. Some fought their way out. Some didn't. Hartwell's platoon had been tasked with clearing a district near the Pasig River. They'd advanced into what they thought was a secured area and walked straight into an ambush. Japanese infantry hit them from 3 sides. Machine gun fire, grenades, rifle fire from upper-story windows. The platoon disintegrated. Men went down. Others scattered. Hartwell ran, firing blindly, trying to reach cover. He made it to an alley, ducked behind a pile of rubble, and found himself alone. He could hear shouting, American voices, Japanese voices, screaming, gunfire. He waited, breathing hard, gripping his rifle. Then silence. He stayed hidden for 3 hours. When he finally moved, he found the street empty. Bodies, debris, smoke, but no platoon, no Americans. He was lost in a city that was tearing itself apart, and he had no idea which way was safe. Hartwell survived 2 days on his own, moving at night, hiding during the day, scavenging food from abandoned buildings. He saw things he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Civilians executed in the streets, bodies piled in doorways, entire neighborhoods burning. On the 3rd day, exhausted and disoriented, he stumbled into a Japanese patrol. He raised his hands, dropped his rifle, surrendered. He thought he'd be taken to a POW camp, processed, held under the Geneva Convention. He was wrong. The Japanese soldiers bound his hands, shoved him into the back of a truck, and drove him out of the city. There were others in the truck, 6 American soldiers, all of them captured in similar circumstances, all of them young, all of them terrified. Nobody spoke. The truck drove for hours, bumping along dirt roads, deeper into the countryside. When it finally stopped, they were in the jungle, dense, green, oppressive. The soldiers were dragged out, marched along a narrow trail, and brought to a clearing where a crude camp had been built. Bamboo cages, guard posts, a single open-sided shelter for Japanese guards. This was where Hartwell would spend the next 6 weeks. This was where he'd lose hope, and this was where he'd learn what it meant to survive when survival felt impossible. The camp held 44 American prisoners by late February. Most were infantry, privates and corporals captured in Manila or the surrounding areas. A few were engineers, medics, support personnel caught in the chaos. The oldest was 23. The youngest was 17, a kid named Espinoza who'd lied about his age to enlist, shipped to the Philippines in January, and captured 2 weeks later. He still had acne, still talked about his high school girlfriend, still cried at night when he thought nobody could hear. The prisoners were held in 3 bamboo cages, each measuring roughly 12 feet by 20 feet. The cages were open to the elements. No roof, no walls, just vertical bamboo poles lashed together with rattan. The floors were dirt. There were no blankets, no mosquito nets, no sanitation beyond a trench latrine dug 50 feet from the cages. The guards were a mix of regular Japanese infantry and what appeared to be stragglers, older men, possibly reservists, exhausted and poorly supplied. There were 8 guards total, rotating in shifts, armed with rifles and a single light machine gun mounted on a tripod near the guard shelter. They didn't speak English, didn't interact with the prisoners beyond shouting orders and distributing the daily ration, a single bowl of rice gruel per man, watery and flavorless, barely enough to sustain life. The first week was the hardest. The prisoners didn't know why they'd been brought here, didn't know if they'd be interrogated, executed, or simply left to rot. Fear was constant. Every time the guards approached, every time they shouted in Japanese, every time they gestured with their rifles, the prisoners braced for the worst. But the worst didn't come. No interrogations, no beatings, no executions, just confinement, starvation rations, heat, rain, insects, disease. It was a slow death, not a fast one. And in some ways, that was worse. Hartwell spent those first days sitting in the dirt, back against the bamboo, trying to understand what was happening. He'd been trained to expect certain things as a prisoner of war, processing documentation, communication with the Red Cross. But none of that was happening. This wasn't a formal POW camp. This was something else. A holding pen. A forgotten corner of a collapsing war. The Japanese weren't interested in the prisoners. They were just keeping them out of the way. And that realization that they'd been discarded, forgotten, was more terrifying than any threat of violence. The prisoners adapted, not by choice, but by necessity. They created routines because routines gave structure, and structure kept the mind from collapsing. Morning roll call. The guards counted them every day at dawn, shouting numbers in Japanese, jabbing rifle barrels through bamboo to wake anyone still sleeping. Then the ration distribution. 1 bowl per man. The prisoners ate slowly, making it last, trying to trick their bodies into feeling full. After that, nothing. The days stretched out, empty and hot. Some men slept. Others talked quietly. A few tried exercise, doing push-ups or walking laps around inside the cage, trying to maintain strength. But most just sat, conserving energy, waiting. Hartwell found himself falling into a pattern. Wake, eat, sit, watch the guards, count the hours, sleep, repeat. It was mind-numbing, soul-crushing, but it kept him sane. Barely. He noticed other men struggling more. Espinoza, the 17-year-old, talked constantly about rescue, about American troops breaking through the jungle, liberating the camp, taking them home. He needed to believe it, needed that hope to survive. Hartwell didn't have the heart to tell him the truth, that nobody knew they were here, that rescue wasn't coming, that they'd been forgotten. So he nodded, let the kid talk, let him hope. It didn't cost anything. By the 3rd week, disease began spreading through the camp. Dysentery hit first, bloody diarrhea, dehydration, fever. The prisoners had no medicine, no clean water, no way to treat it. Men weakened quickly. 1 prisoner, a corporal named Briggs, died on March 8th. He'd been sick for 4 days, unable to keep food down, barely conscious. He died in the middle of the night, quietly, without drama. The guards dragged his body out in the morning and buried it in a shallow grave at the edge of the clearing. No ceremony, no marker, just a hole in the ground. The prisoners watched in silence. Hartwell felt something inside him harden. He'd seen men die in combat, sudden, violent deaths that at least had a kind of terrible logic. But this was different. This was slow, preventable, meaningless. Briggs had survived the battle for Manila, survived the ambush, the capture, the march, and then he died in a bamboo cage from dehydration because nobody gave him clean water. That death stayed with Hartwell, made him angry, and anger, he realized, was better than despair. Anger meant he was still fighting, still refusing to accept this. The guards weren't monsters. That was the strange part. Hartwell had expected cruelty, beatings, torture, executions. But the guards were mostly indifferent, tired. They went through the motions of their duties, counting prisoners, distributing rations, standing watch, but without enthusiasm or malice. A few were visibly malnourished themselves. Their uniforms were ragged. Their rifles were dirty. One guard, an older man with a graying beard, sometimes at the edge of the clearing, and stared into the jungle with the same empty expression the prisoners wore. He looked like a man who'd given up, like he knew the war was lost and was just waiting for it to end. Hartwell watched him, tried to understand him, tried to see him as a person, not just an enemy. It was hard. This man was complicit in their suffering. But he was also human, exhausted, scared, caught in a war he probably didn't want to fight. Hartwell didn't forgive him, but he understood him, and that understanding made everything more complicated. In the fourth week, something unexpected happened. One of the guards, a younger man, maybe 25, who the prisoners called Slim because of his thin frame, started bringing extra food. Not much, just small things. A handful of rice, a piece of dried fish, a coconut. He'd approach the cage at night, after the other guards were asleep, and slide the food through the bamboo without a word. Then he'd walk away. The first time it happened, the prisoners didn't know what to make of it. Was it a test? A trap? But the food was real. They ate it. And the next night, Slim came back with more. He never spoke, never explained, just gave them food and left. Hartwell didn't understand why. Maybe Slim felt guilty. Maybe he was just tired of watching them starve. Maybe he was hoping for leniency if the Americans won. The reason didn't matter. The food mattered. It wasn't enough to stop the hunger, but it was enough to keep hope alive. And hope, Hartwell realized, was the most dangerous and most necessary thing they had. Dangerous because it could break you when it failed. Necessary because without it, you stopped fighting, stopped caring, stopped being human. The prisoners started talking about rescue again, not in the desperate, frantic way Espinosa had talked about it, but quietly, carefully, like men examining a fragile thing. They speculated about American troop movements, about whether the Army knew they were missing, about whether search parties were looking. A sergeant named Calloway, captured near Cabanatuan, had been a POW once before, briefly, in 1942, before escaping during Bataan Death March. He told them what he knew. If they think you're dead, they won't look. If they think you're in a registered camp, they'll wait for liberation. But if they don't know where you are, you're on your own. It was a brutal truth, but it was a truth. The prisoners understood. They were in a camp that didn't officially exist, held by guards who weren't reporting them. In a jungle nobody was searching. Rescue wasn't coming. If they wanted to survive, they'd have to do it themselves. But escape wasn't an option. The jungle was too dense, too hostile. They had no maps, no supplies, no weapons. Most of them were too weak to walk 10 miles, let alone navigate hostile territory. So they stayed, and they waited, and they hoped that someone, somewhere, knew they were alive. By early April, the situation was deteriorating. The guard supplies were running out. The daily ration shrank from 1 bowl of rice gruel to half a bowl, then a quarter. Some days there was no food at all. The guards were visibly nervous. They argued among themselves, pointed at maps, gestured toward the jungle. Something was changing. The prisoners could feel it. One morning, the guards packed up their gear, bedrolls, ammunition boxes, personal items. The prisoners watched, hearts pounding. Were they leaving? Were they taking the prisoners with them? Were they going to execute them before they left? Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The tension was unbearable. Then the senior guard, an older man they called captain, though they didn't know his actual rank, walked to the cages, looked at the prisoners, and said something in Japanese. One of the prisoners, a radio man named Kovacs who'd picked up a little Japanese, translated haltingly. He says they're leaving, Says, we stay here. Says, American troops coming. The guard turned and walked away. The guards gathered their gear, formed a column, and disappeared into the jungle. Just like that. They were gone. The prisoners sat in stunned silence. Hartwell stared at the empty clearing. The guards were gone. The camp was abandoned. They were alone. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Kovac stood up, walked to the bamboo door of the cage, and pushed. It swung open. It had never been locked. The guards had just told them it was locked, and they believed it. Kovacs laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. We could have walked out any time. But they couldn't have. Not really. Not into the jungle. Not without food or maps or strength. The unlocked door was a cruel joke. Freedom without the means to use it. The prisoners filed out of the cages, blinking in the sunlight, looking around. The camp was theirs. But they had no food, no water, no idea where they were or how to get out. They were free, and they were still trapped. Calloway, the sergeant, took charge. He'd been a POW before. He knew what to do. We stay here. Don't move. If American troops are coming, they'll find us. If we wander into the jungle, we'll get lost or walk into a Japanese patrol. We stay. We wait. We survive. The prisoners agreed. They scavenged the camp, found a few bags of rice the guard had left behind, some tools, a canteen. Not much, but enough for a few days. They rationed it carefully, boiled water from a nearby stream, set up a watch rotation in case Japanese troops returned. And they waited. 1 day, 2 days, 3. The jungle was silent except for birds and insects. No gunfire. No aircraft. No sign of anyone. Hartwell sat by the stream, filling canteens, and wondered if the guard had been lying, if there were no American troops coming, if they'd been abandoned here to die slowly instead of quickly. He didn't say it out loud, but he thought it, and he could see the same thought in the faces around him. On the 4th day, they heard it, distant at first, a low rumble. Engines. The prisoners froze, listening. The sound grew louder. Vehicles. Multiple vehicles. Coming closer. Hartwell's heart pounded. Japanese? American? He didn't know. The prisoners grabbed whatever they could use as weapons, sticks, rocks, a rusted machete someone had found. They waited. The sound stopped. Voices. English. American voices. Shouting. Anybody here? U.S. Army. If you're here, show yourselves. Hartwell ran toward the sound, stumbling, shouting. Here! We're here! He crashed through the underbrush and emerged onto a dirt road. 3 American trucks. 2 jeeps. Soldiers in clean uniforms, armed with rifles, staring at him. One of them, a lieutenant, stepped forward. Jesus Christ. Who are you? Hartwell tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He swallowed, tried again. PFC Billy Hartwell, 37th Infantry Division. We've been prisoners. 6 weeks. There's 43 of us. The lieutenant stared. Then he turned and shouted, Medic! Get the medics up here. We got POWs. The soldiers swarmed forward. Hartwell felt hands on his shoulders, guiding him toward a truck. He looked back and saw the others emerging from the jungle, gaunt, filthy, stumbling, alive. They were alive, and rescue had come, not when they expected it, not how they imagined it, but it had come. The prisoners were evacuated to a field hospital near Manila. They were examined, treated for malnutrition, dehydration, infections, parasites. Hartwell had lost 40 pounds. His feet were covered in sores. His gums bled from scurvy. But he was alive. They all were. 44 men captured. 1 died in the camp. 43 rescued. The odds could have been so much worse. The Army debriefed them, recorded their statements, tried to piece together what had happened. The camp, it turned out, had been a temporary holding facility set up by a retreating Japanese unit. The guards had been stragglers, cut off from their main force, trying to survive. When American troops advanced into the area, the guards had fled, leaving the prisoners behind. The Americans hadn't been searching for the camp. They'd stumbled onto it during a routine patrol. Pure chance. Luck. The prisoners had survived because of routine, because of small kindnesses from a guard named Slim, because of Calloway's experience, because they'd stayed together, and because, at the last possible moment, someone had found them. Hartwell was sent back to the States in May. Honorable discharge. A small pension. He went home to Wisconsin, saw his family, tried to readjust. It was hard. The jungle stayed with him. The hunger, the heat, the bamboo cages, the feeling of being forgotten. He had nightmares for years, always the same, sitting in the cage, waiting, watching the jungle, knowing nobody was coming. He'd wake up sweating, heart racing, and have to remind himself it was over. He was home. He was safe. But part of him never left that clearing. Part of him was still waiting. He got a job, got married, had kids, lived a quiet life, didn't talk much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he'd been captured, held for a while, then rescued. He didn't talk about the waiting, the starvation, the despair, the unlocked door. Those things were too hard to explain, too personal, too raw. He carried them silently, the way most veterans carried their wars. In 1985, 40 years after the war, Hartwell attended a reunion organized by survivors of the 37th Infantry Division. He met Kovacs there, the radio man who translated the guard's final words. They recognized each other immediately, shook hands, didn't say much. What was there to say? They'd survived. That was enough. Later, sitting alone, Kovacs asked, "You ever think about Slim?" Hartwell nodded. "Every day." Kovacs smiled sadly. "Me too. Never knew his name. Never saw him again. But he kept us alive." Hartwell agreed. "Yeah, he did." The story of the jungle camp north of Manila is barely documented. A few lines in after-action reports. A brief mention in unit histories. No names. No details. The camp wasn't liberated. It was stumbled upon. The prisoners weren't heroes. They were survivors. And the guard who brought them food, Slim, was never identified, never thanked, never acknowledged. He disappeared into history, just another anonymous soldier in a war full of them. But his actions mattered. He saved lives, not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through small, quiet kindnesses delivered in the dark. A handful of rice, a piece of fish, a coconut, things that seem insignificant until you're starving. Then they become everything. That's the lesson Hartwell took from the jungle. That survival often depends on small things, small choices, small acts of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. And that even when hope seems impossible, even when rescue seems like a fantasy, even when you're locked in a cage in the middle of nowhere with no reason to believe anyone knows you exist, sometimes, if you hold on long enough, someone finds you, not because of a plan, not because of strategy, but because of luck and persistence and the stubborn refusal to give up. The prisoners who survived the jungle camp carried their experience differently. Some, like Espinoza, the 17-year-old, struggled for years with trauma, guilt, and anger. He believed rescue would come, and when it almost didn't, when they'd been abandoned and left to die, something inside him broke. He spent decades in and out of therapy, unable to reconcile the betrayal he felt, not by the enemy, but by his own side. Others, like Calloway, the sergeant who'd taken charge, found strength in the experience. He went on to become a counselor for veterans, helping others navigate the psychological aftermath of captivity. He spoke publicly about the importance of routine, hope, and leadership in survival situations. And some, like Hartwell, simply lived quietly, carrying the memory without speaking it, finding meaning not in the trauma but in the fact that they'd survived it. There's no single response to what they went through, no correct way to process it. Each man carried it in his own way, and each found his own path forward. But they all shared one thing, the knowledge that they'd been forgotten and then found. And that made all the difference. The broader context of the Philippine campaign explains, in part, why the jungle camp went unnoticed for so long. By early 1945, the fighting in the Philippines was chaotic. Japanese forces were collapsing, but they were fighting desperate rearguard actions, hiding in mountains and jungles, refusing to surrender. American forces were advancing rapidly, liberating towns and cities, but they couldn't search every square mile of jungle. Thousands of Japanese soldiers remained at large, living off the land, moving constantly, avoiding contact. The prisoners in the jungle camp were caught in that chaos. The Japanese guards who held them weren't part of any organized unit. They were stragglers, survivors, men trying to avoid capture themselves. They didn't report the prisoners because they had no way to report them. No radio, no command structure. They were on their own, just like the prisoners. And when the end came, when American troops got close, the guards made a choice. They could execute the prisoners and eliminate the evidence, or they could leave them and hope for mercy. They chose the latter. It wasn't kindness necessarily. It was pragmatism, but it saved 43 lives. And in war, pragmatism that saves lives is as close to mercy as you're likely to get. The question of why Slim brought extra food haunted Hartwell for the rest of his life. He wanted to believe it was compassion, that Slim had looked at the starving prisoners and felt something, guilt, pity, empathy, that he decided, in his own small way, to resist the cruelty of the situation. But Hartwell also knew it could have been something else. Maybe Slim was hedging his bets, hoping that if the Americans won, someone would remember his kindness. Maybe he was simply following his own moral code, a code that said you don't let people starve if you can prevent it, even if they're the enemy. Maybe he was just a decent man in an indecent situation, trying to hold on to his humanity. Hartwell would never know, and the not knowing was part of the burden. He wanted to thank Slim, wanted to find him, shake his hand, tell him he'd made a difference. But that was impossible. Slim was a ghost, a memory, a nameless figure in the dark who'd handed food through bamboo and then vanished. Hartwell had to live with that, had to accept that some debts can never be repaid, some questions never answered. And maybe that was okay. Maybe the act itself was enough. Maybe gratitude didn't require a recipient. Maybe it was enough to carry the memory, to honor it, to pass it forward in his own life. Hartwell died in 2003 at the age of 76. His obituary mentioned his military service, his family, his work as a machinist. It didn't mention the jungle camp. His children didn't know the full story until after he died, when they found a box of letters and documents in the attic. Among them was a handwritten note, dated 1985, addressed to no one in particular. It read, "To the Japanese guard who brought us food in the jungle north of Manila, March 1945. I don't know your name. I don't know if you survived the war. But I want you to know that what you did mattered. You kept us alive. You gave us hope when we had none. I've spent my life trying to do the same for others. Trying to be the kind of man who helps when help is needed, who shows mercy when mercy is hard. I learned that from you. Thank you, Billy Hartwell." The note was never sent. Hartwell had written it and kept it, a private acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid. His children read it and cried. They hadn't known, hadn't understood what their father had been through. And now they did. And they understood why he'd been the way he was. Quiet, kind, always helping others, always giving without expectation of return. He'd been trying to pass forward the kindness that had saved his life. Trying to be Slim for someone else. That was his legacy. Not a war record, not a medal. Just a life lived in gratitude, shaped by survival, guided by the memory of a man he'd never met but would never forget. The final truth of the jungle camp story is this. Survival is rarely about grand heroism. It's about small things. Routine, hope, kindness, the will to hold on one more day. The prisoners survived because they created structure in chaos, because they looked after each other, because one guard chose to bring food instead of turning away, because they refused to give up even when giving up seemed rational, and because, at the last possible moment, luck intervened. Someone found them, not because of a plan, but because of chance. That randomness is terrifying. It means survival isn't guaranteed by courage or virtue, but it also means that even in the darkest situations, even when all seems lost, Something unexpected can happen. A door can open. A hand can reach out. Rescue can come. And that possibility, that slim, fragile, improbable possibility, is what keeps people alive when nothing else can. Hartwell understood that. He'd lived it, and he'd spent the rest of his life honoring it. That's the story. Not of heroes or villains, but of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, clinging to hope, surviving through small acts of humanity, and finding, in the end, that sometimes hope is justified. Sometimes rescue comes. Sometimes, against all odds, you make it out alive. And when you do, you carry the memory forward. You honor those who helped you. And you become, in your own way, the person who brings food in the dark, the person who keeps hope alive, the person who saves lives through small, quiet acts that nobody sees, but everyone feels. That's the legacy of the jungle camp. And it's a legacy worth remembering. If this story moved your heart, subscribe. These memories deserve to be kept alive.